Sam, thank you very much for having us here.
Yeah, welcome today. Thank you. Yeah, great to meet you.
We're really interested to hear a little bit about what motivated you to step so significantly as you have recently, the housing space, particularly the affordable housing and build-to-rent space.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, so a lot of people think that because we're a non-profit owned by a charity that we did this out of, for social reasons. They're a very, very pleasant byproduct, but the fundamental reason we're in this is because it's a great investment. And if you think about why that is, it's really very simple. It's because you and I will always pay the rent or the mortgage, right? We need a roof over our head. It's the last bill you won't pay. So I call it getting close to the cash, right? If you want to, if like us, we're going to be around for 100 years. We're a non-profit, so we won't make any money. We're not worth any money, so we'll never be bought or sold, right? So we have a 100-year view. If you have a look at a 100-year view, what are the 100-year investments? Well, if you look at that, you think, what will people always want? And there are two things, right? A roof over their head and food in their mouths. They have to spend money on those things. So it's a great investment from that point of view. And lots of New Zealanders know this, right? If you add in the tax advantages you have by doing that, and if you add in our particular ability to build houses to a much higher quality at a much lower cost, and interestingly much faster, then we have a serious competitive advantage. So it's a really reliable investment. It's one that we can build and operate and own for 100 years, which is fantastic. We can do it in scale. And as a consequence of all that, and give our investors a good return, look at the good it does for New Zealand, right? We're owned by a charity here, right? We fund a lot of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. With so many food parcels, so much help for women's refuge and all those sorts of things. The ultimate fence at the top of that cliff, the thing that stops people falling off, is a warm, dry home. It's number one. So if we can make money by building that fence and operating that fence, keeping people falling off, and it ends, everyone wins, right? In fact, it's an unbelievable win-win.
Good to hear you talking about upstream interventions, and that's something that we talk about and think about deeply in the community housing sector.
Yeah.
And one of the constraints for many years has been access to low-cost finance.
Yeah.
We're really interested in deep thought and intervention at the point of root cause.
Yeah.
Particularly in New Zealand, I've heard you address it numerous times on the likes of Radio New Zealand, is that this is a wicked or complex problem. I quite frequently reject the characterisation of the housing crisis as a complex problem. Actually, we just don't have enough long-term, stable, affordable housing.
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that we don't have enough houses, full stop, right? So at the very simplest level, this is just a simple economic issue of supply and demand, right? So, and the lack of supply is because in the late 70s, the government stopped building so many state houses, and they've been building them for 30 or 40 years now. We've got a structural undersupply. The private market have been doing what they do, but the government hasn't been supplying enough. And I think that's because sort of almost unintentionally, the politicians liked the fact that house prices went up. I think there are lots of happy voters there, even though obviously more and more people suffered at the bottom end there. So we've got a major issue of supply there. So that in that sense is very simple. The actual, the complex part of it is actually the building of the houses. It just takes time, right, and effort. That can be complex, although New Zealanders make it massively complex by wanting everything to be customised and different and sympathetic to the community and so on. But when you look at the great house building projects in history, including in New Zealand in the 1930s, James Fletcher only had 3 different types of houses: single bay villa, double bay villa, and there was one other. That was it. And he just built thousands, and there's one colour scheme and all that sort of stuff. So it can be made simple by repetition and scale. And that's what we want to do. So in its current form, yes, there's what I call a phyllo pastry of fees and complexity through having small-scale bespoke projects. What we need is big, long-term thinking about building high-quality, repetitive housing. And once you do that, you solve a lot of problems. We're doing. We are actually building houses in volume. They are actually 30 to 40% cheaper than the market. They are actually built to twice the building code in terms of longevity. They'll last at least 100 years and arguably 200 years. So, it is doable. It's achievable. We can actually solve this problem.
Sam, you've talked about the long term, which is a very refreshing thing to hear someone talking about in the New Zealand context, because it was many years ago that our New Zealand government did away with the one function that really fulfilled that role within a long-term strategic planning from a government perspective process. Ganesh Nana, when we interviewed him, talked about this, and it was one of the most substantive recommendations in his recent productivity commission, was to have that long-term planning function that looks like, looks at things like immigration, population growth, chronic, cumulative undersupply, for example, of affordable housing. Finance plays a really important role in addressing and unlocking the potential that we have within our system. What levers are you pulling?
So look, there's hundreds of billions of dollars of savings in New Zealand. A lot of it's in term deposits, and that tends to fuel the existing mortgage market and make huge profits for the banks. But there's also very large pools of money in KiwiSaver, NZ Super, ACC, and so on, and growing, quite markedly now. So what we're trying to do is create the precedent for other KiwiSaver providers, in our case, show them that it's actually possible to build and fund and operate this asset class, and it'd be a really good investment. And so, it's all very well talking about it, but someone's just got to do it, right? There's a lot of talk, not much walk in doing this. And I think the other interesting thing, you're talking about long term, right? Let me give you an example of how short term thinking our market is. At the moment, we love greenfields developments. We go out rather than up. But that's because nobody who's funding that is thinking beyond about 2080. The demographers tell us that in about 2080, Auckland and the other cities might start shrinking. Our population might start shrinking. And if you look at Seoul and Tokyo and other cities where the population is starting to shrink, there's a retreat towards the centre because people are social animals, right? So actually what we might be doing is laying a whole lot of infrastructure and housing into areas that are literally abandoned. You see this in Italy as well, just abandoned towns, right, because the population is shrinking. So we have to really future-proof our thinking here. What are we building that people will always want to live in, not necessarily just want to buy now? Right. So, there's a real short-termism there. Now, when you are operating a long-term pension fund as we are, and particularly as a non-profit, we really do think out 100 years. We really do intend owning these homes forever, effectively. So you really do pay a lot of attention to that. And you pay a lot of attention to what you build, by the way, too. If we were building apartments to sell, we'd build them as small as possible, as cheaply as possible, just to get the highest price possible, stick a bit of bling on them, we call it. If you're building it for 100 years, you build them out of more durable materials, which need lower maintenance. You put in bigger lifts, you put in more reliable everything, because it's a false economy to just build this to look good as a show home and then sell it, give someone else the problems. There'll be our problems if we own them for a long period of time. So I think also the quality of the housing stock, and this applies just as much to community housing as it does to any other sort of housing. You need really high quality. It's not good enough just to build a lot of houses. Because if you were just building a lot of cheap houses to building code, which is only 50 years, in New Zealand, it's perfectly legal to sell a house on day one that will be condemned in year 51, right? Crazy. So you have to build these things to last a lot more time. And by the way, that's the right environmental thing to do too, right? Way better to spend 5 or 10% more on a house and stick some more materials in now, rather than have to build 2 houses in the lifespan of a properly built one. So there's a whole lot of false economies and short-termism. And likewise in finance, the interesting thing, the big sea change in how you should think about housing is a lot of people think of it as a speculative asset class and a risky asset class. It is not. If you build a lot of houses where people are living in it and enjoy it and pay the rent, it's a little bit like a government bond in terms of risk, because it's the last bill people won't pay. So if you start thinking about owning a lot of homes and renting them out over the long term, this is how we think about it. We just want a little bit more than we would get by investing in government bonds, because we know that if the housing stock is good enough, people will always pay the rent. And by the way, at times when you get financial market collapses, share market goes down, and even the bond market goes down, people will still be paying the rent. still paying the mortgage. It's a highly reliable asset class if you manage it properly. Now, that's what unlocks the financial floodgates. When the market, and by the way, in New Zealand, we're very unusual. Elsewhere, pension funds get this. Elsewhere, there's a huge amount of investment in build-to-rent and social housing by pension funds, just not in New Zealand. So, but once they get it in New Zealand, they will. We've got it, which means others will. Then the financing is not going to be such a problem. Then we won't be so beholden to the big banks and the decisions they make, which are invariably about maximising profit in the short term and taking the lowest risk that they can, just by lending to owner-occupiers.
Sam, I'm interested to dive a little bit deeper on the finance, and in particular looking at the perceived or real risks around the finance, because, Bernard Hickey doesn't joke about the New Zealand economy being a housing economy with some other bits tacked on. He's not far off the truth, because my understanding is the big Aussie banks have over 60% of their current loan books out in residential property.
Yeah, no, he's completely correct.
Can you talk to me about your view on risk and residential?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, isn't it? So if you look at the banks, what they call risk weight their lending, right? So the lowest risk lending of all is to a first home buyer. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because you'll actually go hungry to pay the mortgage. Like, you will not lose that home you build, right? So that's the lowest risk lending. And residential lending generally is very low risk lending, right? It's one of the things that's so wrong about the profits the banks make in New Zealand, because it's such low risk profit making. But that logically extends to all residential housing, because somehow the money is coming in to pay the rent or the mortgage, whether it's from the government, whether it's from subsidies, whether it's from individuals. And so provided that you're the owner of the house, which is of sufficient quality and so on, it's actually a very low risk asset class. And so how we look at it is, and of course, we're doing market rent housing, but you would call it at the affordable end, because we want people living happily there for the rest of their lives if they want to. So if you look at that, it's extremely low risk if you have enough of it and it's diversified. If you own one or two investment properties, it's risky. It could burn down, someone could not pay the rent, have a bad tenant. If you own 10,000 of them, any one thing that happens is almost irrelevant, right? So you start looking at as a very stable supply of cash. So the financing of houses in New Zealand has typically been done by banks who want to make a lot of money, from people who want to borrow as much money to leverage it up. That inherently increases the risk. And it relies an awful lot on the resale value of that property, the ability to sell it at that time. If you take away those three things, if you say, we're going to have funding where the banks don't have to make money, we just make money for our members and we lend to our members. So that's what building and thrift societies have done for centuries, right? Let's do that. That de-risks that. If we say that we're building a house which is of very high quality so people will want to live in it, which means they will pay the rent. So if you build sufficiently high quality housing and you have, as it were, a pleasant experience, you've got an extremely secure cash flow. So the myth about financing residential housing is that it is risky. Well, you can make it risky if you want to. If you borrow too much money from someone who wants to make too much money from you as the borrower, and if the asset that you're buying is a bit substandard, yeah, that's risky. But if you want to make a reasonable return over the long term, if you want to own a high quality product, which means people want to live in it and pay the rent, it's a low risk asset, right? So, there's no one rule here. And what, we're going to show and are showing and are experiencing, because it's really happening. I'll give you an example. Of all the homes that we've rented, we haven't had a single person leave yet. Right? They love being there, right? It's a good experience, yeah. And they are a community, So if you do it that way, but you have to have a long-term thinking. So the tyranny of the housing market in New Zealand is, ironically, short-term thinking about a long-term asset. So if everyone's thinking about short-term profits, short-term margins, buy and flick, buy and sell, short-term tenancies, all that instability and insecurity and so on generates risk. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Sam, I've sat side by side with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development at the table at the Reserve Bank, talking to them, particularly now. We've been talking broadly around residential housing in the New Zealand context. Now I'm narrowing down into a particular type of housing, and that's housing that's funded by the income-related rent subsidy, where sometimes there's a 25-year contract with the government to help support the resident household. They're paying as much rent as they can afford, and the government's topping that up to market rent for 25 years. Our position from a community housing perspective is that that's fundamentally a different asset class, a lower risk asset class, and should therefore attract lower cost finance. The Reserve Bank's response to that is that the banks already have the ability to recognise it as a different asset class. Our point is, while they're not, they're choosing not to. How do we unlock some of this mental model stuff that's happening that is costing us as New Zealand taxpayers so much money?
It's a very good question. Look, I think one thing you have to realise about the finance industry is inherently a very conservative industry that just wants to do what it's always done, because doing what it's always done is highly profitable and highly lucrative, right? So if you want to get funding into community housing in volume, as we're starting to provide now, the thing that unlocks it is make it look and feel like any other investment, right? Then you just do it once, you just do it again. Oh yes, it's one of those. We've done that before, we'll do it again, right? You just got to make it repeatable and familiar, because you're absolutely right. If, we look at community housing bonds kind of almost like government guaranteeing debt, because fundamentally there's a rental housing subsidy. That's not going to get turned off, because that would be political dynamite if you threw people out of their homes and they couldn't afford it. And so there's a high degree of security. And remember, it always comes back to this very simple truth. Your rent is the last bill you won't pay, because you have to have a roof over your head, right? And so that makes it actually inherently much less risk. But if you bespoke it, if you make it difficult to understand, if you layer it, lots of complexity, finance industry runs away, because it's so easy just to lend to another home buyer, right? You've got to make it easy. That is a sad indictment on our industry, but it is the unfortunate truth. So, however, it's not unsolvable. And you can see now this whole new generation of community bonds that are being issued. We've already bought a lot of them, and we just want to buy a lot more because they look and feel the same. We know that there's a really good outcome, but we also know that they are actually a very low risk investment.
Internationally, there are a broad variety of forms that they take, but throughout the OECD, in many areas, there are bond aggregators and financial structures that have some form of government underwrite, guarantee, or first loss position as the way to reduce the cost of finance for new social and affordable housing supply. Closest to home, it was called the NHFIC, now called Housing Australia. There's a Kiwi in there, John Ross, for example, head of origination, who's literally putting billions of Australian dollars into affordable housing supply and seriously undercutting the banks in doing so for the benefit, I would say, of the nation and particularly of the households that we walk alongside. What impediments do you think are in place in the New Zealand context that stop us from taking that bold step and providing closer to government cost of funds capital into this market?
Yeah, look, I think you summarised it with the word bold there. If you think it's high risk, you'll behave as if it's high risk. If you think it's low risk, you'll behave accordingly. There is no impediment. There is none. So it is entirely possible that we could have billions of dollars funding community housing. Our intention is to have, long-term intention, have billions of dollars in community housing because it's a great investment. But you have to start doing it. You have to show that it's repeatable and scalable and so on. But look, here's the crazy reality, right? We can build a 2-bedroom apartment and rent it for, let's say, $600 a week. And that makes money for our investors. That is a really good long-term investment. The government could choose that, to buy that model or fund that if they wanted to, any way they wanted it. Or they can stick that same family in a motel and pay over $2,000 a week, right? So For about less than a third of the cost, there is a solution. And by the way, there's nothing new in that. There's not a single piece of new technology, not a single new idea. It's just an issue of wanting it to happen in terms of the supply of the homes and wanting to happen it to happen in terms of funding it. So now we're going and getting, funding via KiwiSaver and setting up our own fund to do this, but the government could actually facilitate the supply of a monstrous amount of this housing, like lots and lots of these homes, by simply adopting that attitude that actually it is possible to build these things and fund these things in scale. And if they provide the certainty of funding, trust me, they will come, the builders will come, the supply will arrive.
One of the privileges I have is working with the community housing sector. 70 amazing organisations, some have been around for over 100 years. They're the City Missions, they're the Habitat for Humanities, the Accessibles, etc. They're quite widely reporting to me on a regular basis right now that things are continuing to get worse, not better.
Yeah.
And that is deeply unsettling for many of us who care about the sort of place we want to live in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the sort of place we want to leave to the next generation and one after that. Those issues are broad and varied. Their antisocial behaviour and the increases in that, their addictions, their mental and physical health issues, access to affordable housing is a fundamental root cause of that social fabric fraying at the edges. Where does this go if we don't get a little bit bolder about solving this together?
Yeah. So, well, here's another interesting view. When you think out 100 years, right, I'm a student of history, and one of my favourite lines is, the seeds of revolution are sown in inequity, right? So if we have a society where you have a permanent underclass, if we're talking about ram raids now, why does ram raids surprise us? If you have kids who don't have a warm, dry home to live in and don't have any stability, and with that, quite frankly, any hope. Life is not the movies. Like, most people do not pull themselves out of poverty and become sports stars or movie stars or billionaires, right? Most of them are in grinding poverty. Poverty sucks. And if you don't have money, you don't have choices in life. If you don't have choices, you don't have dignity. And if you want to strip someone of dignity, that's the next generation of just trouble and poverty and horrible outcomes. So, it's not all about housing, but goodness gracious me, an awful lot of it is about it, about having that and having that stability. So, we call ourselves a dignity company. We want people to have dignity by having choices in life. You have choices in life by having money. And part of the thing is the money to pay the rent, money to have a roof over your head. So we are in this insane situation in New Zealand. We have the most unaffordable housing market in the OECD now, right? 25% of New Zealand families spend 40% of their disposable income on rent or mortgage. It's the least affordable market. And yet here we are in one of the least densely populated countries. There's heaps of land. We have all the natural resources. We have a nice temperate climate in which to build. We can build houses all year round. So the raw materials aren't expensive. It is crazy. So what we are doing is showing that if you vertically integrate, right, if you buy the land, develop it, build it, then operate and run the homes and bring the tenants in and collect the rents and do all that, this is what you can do, and this is how much money you can make, and this is repeatable. And hopefully, if we're an example of that, then we can show other people can do the same thing. Likewise, if we can be a huge funding conduit for community home builders who have the land, know the builders to build it, know what they want to build, have all, there is an ocean of good intentions in this, but you have to create the ability for them to do it. Funding seems to be the bottleneck in many cases. Let's open it up. Let's turn that tiny vein into a giant artery, right? And then we get houses built all over the country. And if we get scale development solutions, so for example, we provide all of our IP to anybody for free. We will show you how to build really high quality homes at a really affordable price. this can happen. As soon as you throw in the towel, the fight's over. But this is the fight for the dignity of a whole generation of New Zealanders here. And, we're determined to fight to make that happen. And we're absolutely convinced you can. And we now have a working model which shows it's possible. And we just want to make that available, We'll build 1,000 homes a year ourselves should be doing that within 3 years now. But we need 20,000 homes built, and so, but the funding, I don't think the funding is going to be a problem. I think that is now changing, and that's cool. So you can get optimistic about that. Yeah, we're going to crack this nut. We've got to a situation of genuine desperation now, right? But that is necessity is the mother of invention. We are an example of that. Others will come along as well, and because it's almost like a war mentality now, isn't it? This is a war on poverty in one sense, a really important sense. So, we have a habit of winning wars, and we're going to win this one.
In times gone by, the national-led government and the Labour-led governments, particularly 30s, 40s, 50s, were competing with each other to see who could do more housing. And there was a quite widely accepted definition of the New Zealand dream and New Zealand society as being a broad-based property-owning democracy. Any thoughts on the New Zealand dream in 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, it's interesting, eh? My parents are like a whole generation of New Zealanders who went into a state house and rented it, and then they got a state advances loan to buy the house they were in, and then just got them on the ladder, and then after that they were away, right? That dream seems to have disappeared. In fact, one of the things that got me into all of this was my daughter coming back and saying, "Dad, I don't think I'll ever own a home." I was thinking, wow, not because she didn't want to, she would never have the money to. And it's my daughter, so it's very real. But I think that the big issue is this. In New Zealand, we've had this dream of owning a standalone house, on a quarter acre and then an eighth of an acre and whatever. That is an expensive dream in terms of how much land that takes, how much it costs to build. But that dream means that while 42% of people in the OECD live in an apartment, only 3% of New Zealanders do, right? So the dream has got to be enhanced a bit by having apartment living in more denser, living environments, closer to train stations, closer to supermarkets, walking distance for them. That's got to become an option, which New Zealanders not only want, but actually love, because actually that is the case. A whole lot of Kiwis have gone on and done OE and lived in apartments and, cities all around the world. Get it. They get it. They come back. And that's why, by the way, there are more people living in apartments. But if you look at what it costs to build, own and operate and the quality of life you can have in it, that is a much more affordable dream for New Zealanders. And it should just be an option, yeah? So we just got to change the way we think about what constitutes a home. And the other way of thinking about it too is long-term renting. I went into this apartment in Berlin where the same family had lived in this apartment for 3 generations, and they had been renting from the same owner, pension fund, for 3 generations. They thought about it as their home, and they had the rights of a homeowner in there, as they should, right? So they just never considered owning it. So we need to provide that option as well. The idea that you could long-term rent and have your money saved in different things, whether it's KiwiSaver or different investment assets. But this idea that New Zealanders make their money by property, buying houses and then investment houses, that needs to change. There needs to be more options and it needs to be more acceptable. Because one of the problems with that is if you want to put all of your money into a low productivity asset, like it's necessary and it's important, but it's a low productivity asset, a house, your country just won't grow as fast as it could, right? So we need more money in startup companies and the stock market and private equity and all that sort of stuff. So our dream needs to change in several ways. We've got to kind of get used to and love the idea of being in apartments because, trust me, for a whole bunch of people it's cool. you think about retired couple, right? There are so many people in New Zealand who are asset rich. They own the house. They don't have any other money. They don't have any choices in life. Living in the house is expensive, but what can they do? They sell it and they go into the short-term renting market, and that's scary and unstable, or they have to go and buy a retirement village, right? Why shouldn't they be able to say, listen, and look, we've had this, we have literally been crying when we've had an elderly couple who've come and we've said, here is your new apartment. You can rent this for the rest of your life. You are safe. That's all they want. They want a warm, dry home to feel safe in for the rest of their lives. There is tremendous dignity in there, yeah? And for young families who start out, or couples who don't want children or whatever, to be able to say, listen, it's just another option for you. And so, I think that's how the New Zealand dream has to change a bit. It doesn't have to radically change. You should always be able to buy a house if you want to buy a house and all that, but let's just change our expectation. That, by the way, is the best environmental play too. Denser housing is more environmentally efficient, just uses less power. There's less transport, less getting in the car to go places because you can walk everywhere. And by the way, it's very social. You create communities by having a whole lot of people together, right? And we are social animals. So, there's a whole lot of really cool stuff that comes with this as well. And so let's embrace it. Yeah.
Sam, there's a hell of a lot going on in the New Zealand residential property market at the moment. There's a lot of quite large buildings popping up around the place. There has been, I think, a very unfortunate and unpleasant rise of NIMBYism in the New Zealand context in some neighbourhoods and communities. And in some cases, there is a high concentration of people being put into one place, some of whom didn't really have much of a choice about where they lived. Any reflections from your perspective in terms of how New Zealand can avoid what we've seen, even across in Australia, with some ghettoisation that occurred?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, if you want to turn a high-rise building into a slum, a ghetto, what you do is you pack people in as tight as you can. You sell it so you don't particularly care about what the outcome is, or you become a landlord that's just interested in the rent and taking a short-term view. And then you don't build a community, you don't invest in that. All of that is possible. That is the risk you get when you intensify housing, right? And you see bad examples of that all over the world. But you also see some really good examples. Places like Austria, Germany, France, Spain, there are some fantastic models of private sector ownership and cooperative ownership of housing. But what have you got to do? You've got to have a long-term view. You've got to think, I'm going to own this thing for 100 years, so I'd better maintain it, look after it. If you want to get somebody to disrespect the property that they're living in, then you start disrespecting them, and that's how they'll respond, right? So you've got to invest in it. You've got to be a long-term owner. And that means you've actually got to spend more money and take more time. I'll give you an example. We're building our apartments now. We've just agreed to build them 25% larger than the normal apartment in terms of square footage. Why? Because over 100 years, nothing substitutes for space. You can jam somebody into the smallest space possible. You will create an unpleasant experience. They will not be a happy tenant that way. So you need to invest in it. You need to have a long-term view. And you have to be conscious of the community that you're living in, and you have to invest in that, right? Because if it works really well, all the community facilities, the joy of being in that place gets enhanced by the fact that people are there. There are more consumers in the cafes. There are more people using the public swimming pools. There are more people using the transport hubs, and that works really well. But it's a mindset thing. It's actually got nothing to do, I think, with anything other than caring, and for that caring to be a smart financial decision long term. So short-termism kills dense communities. Long-termism keeps them going very well. There are plenty of examples overseas of how you do this, right? And I'll give you another example. When we build a high-density community, only 1/3 of the land ever has a building on it. So another third of it is just green space. We plant 60 trees for every apartment, and in fact, we plant a native tree somewhere in New Zealand every week for every apartment we rent, right? So eventually we'll be planting 10,000 trees a week and doing that. But you do that, and then you have to have some car parks. And hopefully, if we don't need a car in the future, we'll turn that into more green. But you've got to live in a place where you are close to nature, even though you're in the middle of the city. And that just makes you feel better. Yeah, that is a warm feel. There's a place you want to live, and because you want to live, you'll be a responsible. There's a very virtuous circle here. But you can turn these things into slums or ghettos if you think short term and you just want to squeeze the lemon for the most amount of money. Or in the case of many council developments, particularly in the UK, where they built them with the best of intentions, and then after that, they were just a problem to maintain. It wasn't an economic asset for them. There wasn't a fair return for their investors, right? It just became a social asset, and then when the council needed more money for this politically embarrassing project, it just took money away from maintaining the buildings, right? So, this can go wrong. It all depends on the attitude of the owner. It has to be long-term, and it has to be right.
Sam, we have one of the least affordable housing markets on the planet, certainly in the OECD developed country space. There was a long period of New Zealand history where the median income to median house ratio was about three times income was the house price. And then the last few decades, that has got completely out of balance and headed way north of in some places 9 up to 10 times. A number from earlier, an answer to a question earlier that really stuck out for me was the amount of cost you've driven out of construction. How do we as a nation, given our obsession in residential property as a superannuation fund de facto, how do we get housing affordability back into reality in terms of what people can actually afford?
Well, look, I'll give you the good news. We can. It's possible, right? But here's how it's possible. It's an unwinding of what's been happening. So here's the irony of the New Zealand housing market. It is by far the biggest industry in the country with the most amount of money invested in it. But it's the biggest industry in the country which is run like a cottage industry. What I mean by that is everything is so small scale and bespoke because everyone wants their tile, their tap, their layout, right? And as soon as you do that, then you are customized. It's like every Toyota having to be customized, right? If you want a Toyota, you've got to build it in the factory and you've got to build them all the same. But what we're trying to do is pretend that we'd like, to pay for a Toyota, but we'd like it to be a hand-built Aston Martin, please. It doesn't work that way, right? So if you start applying just simple scale production systems to housing, you will get way lower priced houses. And that just means you've got to get big and you've got to get control. So our industry has what I call a phyllo pastry of fees, right? You start designing it, you get the architect and that's designed and there's no economies of scale there. Then you get the plumber who has to turn up in the ute to your job and then drive and go and get another part and so on and so on. And when you're building your house, you're a price taker every single time, right? But once you start building hundreds a year, right, and in our cases, pretty soon 1,000 a year, then you're a price maker. You go out and you say, okay, here's the deal for 1,000 homes a year for the next 6 years. What's your best price? And I can tell you, it's way lower, right? Because those people value certainty of work or certainty of supply, right? When you start building houses, I'll give you an example. When Shane and Anna started building their first homes out of NZ Living, they had 27 different types of window and door. Now they have 4. We only have 4, right? So once you start building, they're great. The 4 are awesome. They're perfectly fit for purpose. Then you're putting in massive orders. So we have no economies of scale. Now that's the irony. It's the biggest industry in this country with 0 economies of scale, right? And everyone is running around in a small business. Once you start doing that, then you set a new benchmark. Now, what that needs, though, is demand, right? So, and this is the key role of government, providing consistent, stable demand. You build it and they will come, right? If the government was to say, here, we want 3 or 4 major building companies building thousands of homes which look and feel the same to us, the same every year, put in your bid, I can tell you, they'd be building houses way cheaper than they are right now. And that would set the benchmark for everyone else. We need fewer bigger building companies, fewer bigger plumber companies. We need to start bringing in the economies of scale. And I'll give you an example of what that means. To build a house in Canada, to build a house in Calgary in Canada, which is about the same size as Auckland, but where they have economies of scale in building, is about half the price that it is in Auckland right now. That is what you can do. And by the way, that's building it for a city that has, minus 20, minus 30 degrees. These are thermally, acoustically, fire, they're all very, very high quality. And that's what it costs when you get economies of scale. There is no rocket science in this. We are already showing that even ourselves, only having been in business 2 years, are now doing this to that scale, to that price, and are actually building and renting it, So much of what we're doing is just to show what's possible. And just, you want to do this, you want these economies, just do this. Here it is. We'll help you out. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And now that we have enough money, particularly in KiwiSaver, that can fund these operations long term, and now that we have a situation where the other ways of building are just failing New Zealand, right? And so we just have to have, so from the demand side, and I suspect government, community housing providers, someone will say, this is what we want, right? Then the supply will come on. Because I can tell you, when we go to a new town or to a council or to an iwi or a community housing provider of the government and say, look, here's what we can build. I'm sorry, no, there's no variation. This is it. But this is 40% cheaper than you can build anything where you might want to customize it. What do you want? Well, some people will choose the 40%, but an awful lot of people will say, yep, we've got to house our people. And by the way, when you build these things, they've been tested. In our case, there are 900 of them that have been built all around Auckland, and they have got extremely happy tenants and owners, because a lot of them were built under KiwiBuild. They are the highest quality KiwiBuilds you'll see. And so, all of this is possible.
Sam, I'd suggest that there's widespread evidence of market failure, particularly in the affordable housing space in New Zealand. We have now an accumulative deficit of tens of thousands of unbuilt affordable houses as a result of the faith that we placed in neoliberal reforms of the late 80s and early 90s, where we thought the magic market would provide for everybody, and clearly it does not. The market economics of building affordable houses don't work, and they are simply not being built, and there is a role for the government to step in and to intervene in that space to solve this problem. Can you talk us through your view of that and the economics of it, please?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Let's say you're running Nestle or Boeing or Toyota, or any big company, and you go to your suppliers, and what do you say? You say, every 3 years we're going to change our mind about what we might want from you, or we might change our mind about what we're building. Could you just be ready for that, please? We'd like you to change on a dime, and if we decide not to give you the order, tough luck, and we might give you a massive order, in which case we'd like you to be ready for that, like tomorrow, right? That's been the housing market in New Zealand, right? There has been the biggest buyer in town, the biggest checkbook in town in any democracy is the government, right? The government has not been sending the signals to the building market. This is what we want. This is when we want them delivered. This is what we're prepared to pay, right? So if you don't get those signals, you don't gear up for it. You're not ready for it, right? So this chop change in policy, it's okay to say the government have a massive role to play. They always will, and they always have in the provision of affordable housing. But it's the signals they give to private companies and private buyers, and the certainty that they give, right? So if you had multi-decade or even, long-term contracts at a price, and you'd negotiate that, which would give those companies the incentive to invest and be able to provide capacity, you get a lot more houses built at a much cheaper price. But, any politician who comes in and thinks they have the quick fix, all they have to do is X or Y or hire this person or restructure it, they're kidding themselves. It's not a computer that you can turn on and off This is a business that needs lots of people doing lots of things in a coordinated fashion. Here's the irony of the building industry in New Zealand. The building industry at times makes an awful lot of people very wealthy, right? There's an awful lot of people who keep going the way they're doing because they've done very well, thank you, right? But then when it stops, it crashes and those people lose their jobs. So you have this incredibly volatile industry, right? It shouldn't be that way because demographically, we know how many people are going to need houses and we can turn on the immigrator, we know this, but somehow we don't supply the houses with that consistency in the full knowledge that we have it. So let's stop running this like a cottage industry, a stop-start business, and let's start thinking, okay, we have a long-term view on this. This is what we want to achieve long-term. And I promise you, the private sector will build the houses as long as you give them certainty. You know, you can't turn on a dime when you're building houses. You know, you just can't.
Sam, it's been awesome and inspiring, and you've given us hope today with the things you've shared with us. We're very grateful for your time and for the work that you are doing with your team here at Simplicity. Thank you so much.
Cheers.